Alright, well, welcome to week 6. Last week we talked about neurons, how they work, how they fired, how they were connected. Now we're going to take these individual neurons that we studied and we're now going to connect them on a larger scale. And what we're really going to focus on this week is the parts of the brain, how all those neurons are connected and how they all function together. But before we can study the parts of the brain, we have to understand how we actually study the brain to figure out what parts of our brain actually control. Now, peeking inside the brain is done in a couple of ways. One of the first way we do it is by clinical studies. One of the original ways we started looking at the brain is by doing deep lesioning. What that means is we stick a thin insulated wire into the brain, and with the electrical current from that tip, we actually destroy brain cells at the tip of that wire. Now, why we would do this is to see what part of the brain we're actually destroying. If we know beforehand this person can talk normally, we stick that thin wire into the brain and that person can't speak afterwards, well, we've obviously found out the speaking center of the brain. Another way we do, which is a lot more popular, is called electrical stimulation of the brain, which is also known as ESB. It sends a milder electrical current that causes neurons to react as if they received a message. So instead of destroying cells and neurons, we're actually just stimulating them to fire. So ESB is the form you would probably want to be involved in clinical studies. Human brain damage, when we have people who are in car accidents who were normal functioning and then with specific injuries to one part of their brain, when they're studied and they lose the ability to perceive depth, that part of the brain is obviously clearly associated with depth perception wherever they're injured. So we use that information as well. And we also use the EEG, which is a machine designed to record brainwave patterns produced by electrical activity of the surface of the brain. We use this when we were talking about memory and sleeping, especially theta, beta, alpha waves, and all of that. Okay, so these are the major ways we look inside the brain. By using these different techniques of analyzing brains, we've come up with the following information that we know is true. We have learned that there are 3 layers of the brain. We have the brainstem and cerebellum, which drive the vital functions such as heart rate, breathing, and digestion. This is the oldest part of the brain. This is there whether all animals have this basic format, okay? The next one is the limbic system, which is the second layer. It adds emotion, complex motives, increased memory, and ability. Okay, so the cerebellum is the very base of your brain. The next layer is in the center of your brain is the limbic system, and then the cerebellum is the outside. This involves reasoning, planning, creating, solving problems. Okay, the 3 layers. They start at the base of your brain. Brainstem, cerebellum at the very base of your brainstem, limbic system in the center of your brain, cerebellum just outside. Now, since the brainstem is the oldest part of our brain, it's the most important place for us to focus on. Now, located at the brainstem, we have the medulla, the first large swelling at the top of the spinal cord, forming the lowest part of the brain, which is responsible for life-sustaining functions such as breathing, swallowing, and heart rate. So this one part, the medulla, is in charge of all your autonomic functions, breathing, heartbeat, all of that. The pons is a larger swelling above the medulla that connects the top of the brain to the bottom and plays a part in sleeping, dreaming, left body coordination, and arousal. So the medulla is breathing, swallowing, heart rate. The pons is the one that plays a part in dreaming, coordination, and arousal. Here's a little map for you of the brainstem and the cerebellum. Okay, the thalamus, the pons, the cerebellum, medulla, and brainstem. Now the brainstem is that yellow formation. The medulla is that red right on top of that yellow. Okay, the cerebellum is right next to it, the little grainy, and the pons is just above. Don't worry, we're going to get a lot more specific coming right up. Okay, the thalamus is that center part of your brain. The pons is right in that red. The cerebellum, or the little brain, located right behind the very base of your neck. The medulla is that yellow center, and the brain stem is that whole center. Okay? Now the brain stem has what we call reticular formation, an area of neurons running through the middle of the medulla and the pons, and slightly beyond that is responsible for selective attention. So the reticular formation in the middle of the medulla is responsible for all of your selective attention, giving a focus, all of those important tasks. Now the cerebellum, part of the lower brain located behind the pons, actually controls and coordinates involuntary, rapid, and fine motor movement. The cerebellum is also known as the little brain. It manages a lot of things quickly and effectively, so it doesn't have to go through the long process of going through the brain. Now, the reticular activating system is in the center of the pons, okay, goes through the medulla. The cerebellum, or the little brain, is located just behind it. Now, the limbic system is a major focus of this week. It has a lot of aspects that really influence and we use a lot. Now, one of the major aspects of the limbic system is the hypothalamus. This serves as the brain's blood testing laboratory. It constantly monitors blood to determine the condition of the body. The hypothalamus continuously regulates our body. Okay? Now, under the cortex, we have a lot going on. The limbic system is a group of several brain structures located under the cortex involved in learning, motion, memory, and motivation. The thalamus is the major aspect of the limbic system. It's located in the center of the brain. This structure relays sensory information from the lower part of the brain to the proper areas of the cortex. Now, when we're thinking of the cortex, we're thinking of everything above the cerebellum. Okay? So, the thalamus is taking all the information from the lower part of our brain, taking in all those sensory neurons, and processing it through correctly. Okay? So it takes the information, it sees where it needs to go, and dismisses. The thalamus is like the operating system of your brain. It's in charge of sending all the messages to the appropriate place. Now, the olfactory bulbs are two projections just under the front of the brain that receive information from the receptors of the nose just below. We're going to get much more into this information of where the specific receptors are for each of our senses coming up in just a moment. Some more structures that are under the cortex that fall into the limbic system are the hypothalamus, a small structure in the brain located below the thalamus and directly above the pituitary gland, responsible for motivational behavior such as hunger, sleep, sex, and thirst. Okay? The hypothalamus is the one that makes us hungry, makes us thirsty, makes us sleep, and gives us the desire to have sex. It sits above and controls the pituitary gland, okay, and regulates that to send out the hormones necessary. The hippocampus serves as a curved structure located within each temporal lobe, responsible for the formation of long-term memories and the storage of memory for location of subjects. The hippocampus is all about memory. Okay, the hippo needs a memory to remember campus. Okay. The amygdala is a brain structure located in the hippocampus, responsible for fear responses and memory of fear. If you are terrified of flying, the amygdala is the one that reminds you of that every time you think about flying. Okay? So the hippocampus is used for the memories of locations. The amygdala is used for fear and is responsible for fear responses. Okay, all of these fall under the limbic system. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Okay, so let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Now, the thalamus, located in the very center of your brain, relays information from the sensory organs to the cerebral cortex. What that means is the sound of my voice is going into your ears. It's being sent to your thalamus, and it's going to the part of the brain that needs this information. The hypothalamus, which is just below the thalamus, is part of the forebrain that regulates the amount of fear, thirst, sex drive, and aggression we feel. Now, the amygdala influences our motivation, emotional fear, fear response, and interpretations of non-verbal expressions. So, if you're sitting there pouting in class and I see you, and my amygdala is going to be telling me that, hey, that person is not happy, something's going on. Finally, the hippocampus plays a role in our emotions, ability to remember, ability to compare sensory information to expectations. The limbic system, okay, just to kind of simplify it a little bit for you, amygdala involved in memory, emotion, particularly fear and aggression. The hippocampus is involved in establishing long-term memories. The cerebellum, which is a new part that is not a part of the limbic system, okay, it's the topmost layer of the brain. So far we've been talking about things on the bottom. Now we're talking about things on the top. The bulbous, or cap of the limbic system, okay? The cerebral cortex is a thin gray matter covering the cerebellum, which carries on thinking and perceiving. It's a very thin layer that surrounds the top of your cerebellum. Okay, when we look at a real brain, it's very gray and kind of dark looking. That's the cerebral cortex. That's where all of our actual thinking goes. So when we actually use the expression our thinking cap, we're actually referring to our cerebral cortex. The cerebral hemispheres are two walnut-shaped halves of the cerebellum connected by the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is the one managing the two left and right hemispheres. Okay, so the cerebral hemispheres are managed by the corpus callosum. These two hemispheres are in charge of two different things. We'll get into that a little bit later. Now, the cortex is the outermost covering of the brain, consisting of densely packed neurons. Okay, our little thinking cap, responsible for higher thought processes and interpretation of sensory input. So where we're actually doing our thinking process is known as the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum cortex, okay? Corticalization is the wrinkling of the cortex. If you've ever seen a brain, it looks like there's a lot of brain just squished in. It's all wrinkly. That's exactly what we're talking about. It allows a much larger area of the cortical cells to exist in small spaces inside the skull. What that means is the cells, these important cells that are used in our thinking process, need a lot of room. Well, our skulls are so complex, are so small that we actually have to wrinkle so we have more surface space. You're going to get more surface space if you have lots of ridges and valleys and heights than if you just had a flat surface. That's why our brain is all wrinkly. Okay, so let's talk about the human cortex. What makes us different than other animals? You can see a leapfrog. They have a very small brain. They have a grass snake has very small, very small. As you get going through the different animals, a pigeon obviously has a little bit more of a forebrain. Okay, you can see that in the top row, the forebrain or the new brain, which is the frontal cortex, and the hindbrain, which is our basic evolutionary instincts. As the animals get larger, the more the frontal cortex is. But the most important thing is that when you're comparing the chimpanzee and the human, now the chimpanzee is our closest animal relative, and you can see that their brains are not that much smaller than ours. However, if you look at the human's brain, you can see it's a lot more heavily developed in the front than it is at the back. Looking from the back of the brains, they look very similar. That's dealing with our sight, our basic instincts. It's a frontal portion of our brains that make us unique, that give us the ability to reason, think logically, and manipulate our environment. Now, the cerebral hemispheres are two sections of the cortex. There's a left and a right side of the brain. Okay? The corpus callosum is a thick band of neurons that connect the left and the right hemisphere. Now, without the corpus callosum, there's going to be a lack of communication between the left and the right hemisphere. In this brain, we've literally cut a real brain, cut it, and you can see where the corpus callosum is located. Now, when we are talking about the cortex of the brain, we break it down into four major lobes. There's the occipital lobe, which is a section of the brain located in the rear and bottom of each cerebral hemisphere, contain the visual centers of the brain. This is where all of your visual sensors are coming into place. Now, there's the primary visual cortex, which processes vital information from the eyes. The visual association cortex, which identifies and makes sense of the visual information. Okay, so those are the two major, primary and visual association. Primary is actually processing the information. Our visual association cortex identifies and makes sense of it. The parietal lobes are sections of the brain located at the top and back of each cerebral hemisphere, contain the centers for touch, taste, and temperature sensations. The somatosensory cortex is an area of neurons running down from the front of the parietal lobes, responsible for processing information from the skin, and internal body receptors for touch, temperature, body position, and possibly taste. Okay, what all that means is that we have one strip in our brain, and I have a diagram to show you, that controls all of our motor movements, and is located in our parietal lobes. Okay. The temporal lobes are located in the cortex just behind the temples, containing the neurons responsible for hearing and meaningful speech. Okay. They're literally right behind your ears. Okay. What's there is the primary auditory cortex. It processes all the auditory information you're receiving, as well as the auditory association cortex, which identifies and makes sense of the auditory information. In case you haven't noticed the pattern here, there's a primary auditory cortex, which is processing, and then association is the one making sense for all of our senses. There's a primary and an association cortex for each sense. Now, the frontal lobes is what makes us the most unique, which makes us different from any other animal on the planet. The frontal lobes are areas of the cortex associated with the top of the brain, which is responsible for higher mental processes, decision making, as well as production of fluent speech. As we saw in our diagrams of man and beast, you know, monkeys and fish and snakes and cats, that our frontal lobe is much more developed than any of those other ones. All of us can hear, all of us can see. However, it's the development of our frontal lobe that separates us from all of our animal connections. And located in front of our frontal lobes is our motor cortex, which is a section of the frontal lobes located at the back, responsible for sending motor commands to the muscle and the somatic nervous system. So it's our frontal lobe that actually controls our motor skills. Now, here's just a little bit of a visual reference for you. The frontal lobes, movement and thinking, is in the very front of our brain. The parietal lobes and touch, sensation, spatial relationships are in the towards the rear of our brain. The occipital lobes are in the very back of our brain. And the temporal lobes, which process sound, are on the side of our brain. So the frontal is the front, occipital is in the back, parietal lobes are just above our occipital lobes, and our temporal are right along our ears. Now, there's different lobes of the brain for different reasons. This is just another representation so you can get a little bit more of awareness of how large these sections actually are. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe is where all of our sensory and our motor functions are coming from. Temporal is our auditory, and occipital is all of our visual. Alright, so the somatosensory cortex, which we talked about earlier, is the motor cortex in the frontal lobe that controls the voluntary muscles of the body. So when you pick up your hand and scratch your face, you're using this part of your brain. The cells of the top of the motor cortex control muscles at the bottom. As you can see by this really kind of creepy diagram, you can see what part of the brain is actually controlling what part of your body. Like, the one that kind of freaks me out the most is the teeth, the jaws, and the gum, which is on your right hand side of your sensory motor cortex. Okay? Body parts are drawn larger and smaller according to their cortical cells. So the larger the pictures are, the more powerful control this part of the body has. It requires a larger area to control. So you'll notice that our toes have very little cells. Or very little bit of a picture drawn on there. That's because we don't really have that much control over our toes. But you'll see our fingers, thumb, and hand are very large compared to other aspects, so we have a large amount of control. The somatosensory cortex, located in the parietal lobes just behind the motor cortex, is organized in much the same manner. It receives information from the sense of touch and body position. If you look below the creepy diagram, you're going to see where in the parietal lobes we have a motor cortex and a somatosensory cortex. Now, the somatosensory cortex is highlighted in blue, and that's exactly what's being described above it, with the toes, the eyes, the fingers, and the thumbs. Now, just so you can really process a little bit of this information, is that our sensory signals are going up to our somatosensory cortex, which is telling us different parts of the body are doing this or experiencing this, and then the motor cortex takes that information. Well, the information is being processed by the somatosensory cortex, then it gets pushed into the motor cortex, which processes that information and sends that muscle movement to our somatic nervous system. Okay, so you can see the larger the picture is, the more control we have over it. Now, the cerebral dominance is what makes us truly unique, truly powerful. It's our tendency of each brain's hemisphere to exert control over different functions. Our brain can't do everything all at once. That's why it has different regions which do different things. Aphasia, which is something some people do lose, is the loss of speech caused by brain damage. After an accident, sometimes we have people who've lost the ability to speak, and they actually need to be retaught how to speak. Aphasia. Spatial orientation, which means that we lose the ability to control our own bodies, objects in space, which means we don't understand how our body works around us. Like, for instance, if you're trying to pick up a glass of water off a table and you go to reach for it and you literally knock it off the table. Well, you didn't mean to do that, but that's what happens. Or every time you go for a door handle and you end up hitting the middle of the door rather than the handle. That means you have a spatial orientation issue. Now, one of the major ways we've studied the brain is by split brains. What that means is we cut the brain from the left and the right hemisphere right down the middle, and we split the corpus callosum, which allows the two brains to speak. Well, if we split that in half, we're going to see what part of the brain does what. Now, split brain patients are individuals who've had the corpus callosum surgically severed. Sometimes we have seen that babies are actually develop this without the corpus callosum intact, and some people have actually lost them in accidents. So split brain patients come in many different forms. The duality of the consciousness. Now, it's important to note that our left and our right brain, even though they're two separate things, do work very well. However, when patient explores or has the split brain factor come into play, it's when the separate consciousness of each hemisphere is really highlighted, which means one is not contacting or is not interacting with the other. Okay, so duality of consciousness, when there is no corpus callosum in place, when it has been surgically removed, all of a sudden we understand that our brain does completely function separately, but that corpus callosum keeps them together. Okay, so let's look at the major brain structures. Now we have the hypothalamus, which is part of the forebrain that regulates the amount of fear, thirst, sexual drive, and aggression. Okay, the corpus callosum connects the left and right hemispheres. That's what's cut when we're talking about split brains. The cerebral cortex is the outside, controls complex thought processes, our thinking cap. The thalamus is part of the brain that relays information from sensory organs to the cerebral cortex. Okay, it's the call center of the brain. The hippocampus plays a role in our emotions, our ability to remember, and ability to compare information. The hippocampus is very involved in memory. The cerebellum is part of the hindbrain that controls balance and maintains muscle coordination. It's also known as the oldest part of our brain, okay, and allows us the basic functions as well. Reticular formation is a system of nerves running from the hindbrain through the midbrain to the cerebral cortex, controlling arousal and attention. So when you are bored in class, your reticular formation is not fully functioning. Now, the medulla is part of the hindbrain where the nerves cross from one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain. So the medulla is where information is really being pushed from one side to the next. The pons is part of the hindbrain that relays information from the cerebellum to the cortex. It takes the information and brings it into the brain, where the thalamus is the one that sends the information to where it needs to go. The pituitary gland regulates all the endocrine glands throughout our body, regulating hormones, all of that wonderful stuff. Now, the association areas of the cortex, areas within each lobe of the cortex, responsible for the coordination and interpretation of information, as well as higher mental processes. Within each lobe, we're coming across different areas within it. One of the largest areas is Broca's area. It's a condition resulting from damage to Broca's area, usually in the frontal lobe, causing the affected person to be unable to speak fluently. Broca's area is the one that maintains your language. If you damage it and you develop Broca's aphasia, it's where you are unable to speak. Wernicke's area is when you're unable to produce language. Okay? And spatinal neglect. These are all some major disorders. We're really going to get into these mostly next week, but I just wanted you to be somewhat familiar to what we will be seeing. So, now, Broca's area is located on the side of your brain. Wernicke's area. Broca's area, it takes the information, okay, and processes it through Wernicke's. We're going to get much more into this in class. Now, if you have a spatial neglect issue, that means you're not processing information in the right context. So if you look on the left-hand side, you're going to see a model of a clock, of a house, of a flower. If someone who is experiencing spatial neglect, you can see that theirs is a little bit off. Not completely wrong, but it's just not right. You can see on the left-hand side of their drawings, their right side of their brain's okay, but the left side of their brain is not okay. Split brain research. When we use this, we're going to see and develop a lot more insight into how much of an influence the corpus callosum has on our functions. Now, the cerebellum is the upper part of the brain consisting of two hemispheres, and the structure that connects them is known as the corpus callosum. When we do split brain research, we study patients who have a severed corpus callosum. It involves sending messages only to one side of the brain. So in essence, split brain research is when we cut the brain, and our brain left and right hemisphere are not allowed to speak. Demonstrates the left and right specialization. Your right side of your brain does one thing, your left hemisphere does a completely different thing. Okay? So let's just look at what type of things our left and our right side brain does. Now, in our eyes, we have both a left field and a right field. Our brain processes that information differently. If you look at the optic chiasm, which is where all the information is shared, it divides off, where the right field of vision is processed by the left hemisphere, and the left field of vision is processed by the right. Your brain is always opposite. If you are looking at something on the right, your left side of your brain is processing it. When you're looking at something on the left, your right hemisphere. We're going to do a really neat demonstration later. Okay? Now here's one of the more interesting examples of left and right hemispheres. Okay? Roger Sperry is very heavily involved in the split brain experiments. He created this experiment to demonstrate the specialization of left and right hemispheres of the brain. Now, this person has the right brain has been split off. What the right brain is not talking to the left brain. So when we ask this person what do they see, they're going to say, I only see things on the right. Okay? So, what do you see? I see a ball. That's the only thing they can see. When we show them and project them a different aspect, they won't be able to see it. They won't be able to process it even though they're touching it. Okay? If we show a person, what do they see? Okay? This person with split brain, they're going to be able to point to the one person they see. Okay? The person I saw was you. Alright, language is primarily a left hemisphere activity for most individuals. Bless me. Hearing words, seeing words, generating words, speaking words is all calculated by different parts of our brain. So what does our left and right hemispheres do on their own? The left hemisphere does spontaneous speaking and writing. Okay? Overwhelmingly, the left hemisphere is more creative. The right hemisphere is more structured, more repetitive. The right hemisphere, when regarding to speaking, is repetitive but not spontaneous. Left hemisphere responds to complex command, and right hemisphere responses to simple commands. Word recognition is a left hemisphere, right hemisphere is facial recognition. Memory for words and numbers, memory for shapes and music. Okay, sequence of movements, spatial interpretation. Okay, all of these things are done by these parts of the brain, specialized. Doesn't mean it's only occurring on this. So if you're a left-dominated person, you are very good at spontaneous writing and speaking. You have feelings of anxiety, sequence of movements. Okay, you are typically a positive person, while a right-handed person is typically a negative. Not right hemisphere, not right-handed. Facial recognition is very, very good. Response to simple commands. Repetitive speaking is very good as well. Now, what have we learned from results of split brain research? What we found is that the left side of the brain seems to control language, writing, logic, thought, analysis, and math abilities. We can process information sequentially on the left side of our brain a lot better than our right, and our left side of the brain dominates our speaking control. Now, the right side of the brain controls emotional expression, spatial perception, recognition of faces, patterns, melodies, and emotions. We process information globally and cannot speak. So if we separate our corpus callosum, we are very much so not speaking if the damage is on our right side. Now, when we look inside the brain, we use many different technologies. And I know we kind of talked about this the last one, but I know a lot of you guys were a little confused. So I wanted to go into a little bit more depth. Now, CT scan is brain imaging method using computer-controlled x-rays of the brain. Okay, this is an actual CT scan. This is what it looks like. Magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, is brain imaging method using radio waves and magnetic fields of the body produce detailed images of the brain. This is the most detailed we can see. A computer makes a short movie of changes in activity of the brain using images from different time periods. Okay, so it is using a lot more in-depth view of the brain, much more detail. Oh, I guess that's it. Alright, well, thank you. This week wasn't so bad. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class. And make sure you're doing your readings, your outlines, answering these questions to the best of your ability. Some of this information you're just going to have to memorize. Anyway, good luck, and I'll see you in class.